Hi, welcome everyone to my talk. I am Cordero and I'm going to present you my topic. Since I'm going to talk about acoustic and semantic cues during the segmentation of speech in French, I am going to start by talking about the challenge of the continuity of the speech signal, which is that it is naturally highly complex and very variable. And as we may know already, when we are talking about spoken language, actually it is, there are no clear boundaries. So typical interesting questions for psycholinguistics is how do listeners achieve correct speech segmentation and how do we comprehend this speech signal? So basically, what's been shown is that linguistic input enables to activate or inhibit word representations in mental lexicon. And actually, listeners, we use some knowledge from our mother language to actually achieve this speech segmentation. And this can be done by acoustic phonetic information or phonological or lexical cues, and also some cues related to the rhythm or statistical regularities. And actually, a problem that we as listeners face daily is that we have transient segmentation ambiguities in or involved in speech signal. So the important question would be, how do we get this information when we are actually facing homophonic sequences? So how are we achieving to segment the speech when we are facing homophonic sequences, right? For instance, let's talk about the case in French of the resyllabification of the article la or the apostrophe L apostrophe A. For instance, the word l'ami. L'ami would have two representations, either the crumb or the friend. So how are we going to actually correctly segment one or the other? And if we are actually saying that we have to correctly segment l'ami as the signal, as the acoustic signal, we may actually use some, or we may actually consider some acoustic information that it's involved in the speech signal. So, for example, one of the details that we encounter in this signal of l'ami, of these acoustic sequences, is an F0 rise, a rise of the fundamental frequency. As you can see here marked in red, we can see how we go from the L to ami, and this rise starts at the beginning of the content word, of the word, in this case ami, and here for me it would be at the start of the M of the content word again, so it's later. So there are some acoustic information that could relate and could help us go through achieve segmentation. Some behavioral experiments have actually shown that in isolation, French speakers are actually good at identifying these homophonic sequences, and this has been done at 75.5%, and they are also able to discriminate between the two sequences at a level of 66.3%, so it's over chance level actually. So we can consider that acoustic information in l'ami is actually used when presented in isolation, taken from offline evidence. If we go to online evidences, so some electrophysiological experiments done with EEG is concretely done from an MMN study, which it's called a mismatch negativity study. And MMN studies show the correlates to both irrelevant and irrelevant fine acoustic cues or phonemic cues. And one of the examples would be this study by Do Carmo Blanco et al. That in isolation, again, from l'ami, and also from only the first syllable la, contrasting from lami and lami. It has been shown that actually French speakers are well at discriminating both sequences in this case by 79%. So again, over chance level. So again, now we can say that it seems that this acoustic information contained in lami would be used when presented in isolation and even without focused attention during online experiments. So ERPology is a field of study within the electrophysiological studies that we can consider, and it helps us go through online processes of, for instance, speech processing, right? And I present you here our EEG system from our lab. And the aim of this type of studies is to assess the semantic integration of ambiguous sequences. So if we actually consider these acoustic and semantic cues from a point of view of online studies, with EEG, we can actually track this integration of ambiguity. And there's a specific component that's called the N400 component, which is a right centroparietal negativity that it's actually peaking around 400 milliseconds. And I'm gonna show you here an example. You can see here a part of a sentence, and an incongruent word was actually introduced. So the peak would be more negative when integrating this word across a sentence in which it doesn't make any sense. So actually this N400 component has been related to this ease with which a word in a sentence would be actually integrated. So the hypotheses for our study are that, again, we're considering these homophonic sequences of lami-lami. So we want to examine the cues that are involved in processing word boundaries in French. And we want to actually examine the impact on semantic integration of these acoustic features that involve these homophonic sequences. And our main question is, how does the sensitivity to these fine acoustic details actually change when we are presenting also some sentence, some context? So for that, we hypothesized that if fine acoustic details is actually analyzed during this processing of segmentation, so online or real-time processing, then we will not have differences between, we will have some differences between incongruent and congruent context when they are presented in incongruent and congruent context. Whereas if actually we, or French speakers were said, if French speakers are actually considering this information, then we are not going to find any difference between incongruent and congruent context presenting our homophonic sequences. So we made this stimuli accordingly. We created 4 sentences for our different homophones. We had lami and lami. We created 2 sentences each. And then we did a cross-splicing manipulation to actually get our incongruent contexts, and we did a similar processing to actually have stimuli that could be comparable. This would be the experimental design. So we were presenting these sentences to the participants, and there was no active task. So we were actually only adding a semantic judgment test to actually check for control that they were actually being attentive and they were not actually sleeping during the experiment. So how did we analyze this? In a first analysis, what we did, and I'm going to show you, it's an analysis based on the global field potential, and on the global field power. So this helped us actually create the different time windows without actually being biased by some by some noise that could be found in the signal, nor by some perturbations that could happen, so like other components that may arrive also along the signal. And we had the onset from Lamy on. So these are the selected time windows that were actually dividing, like they were actually dividing the signal from the 0, so from our onset until the end of the sentence. And we actually picked them when a peak, a difference in the frequency was appeared. This is the formula that we applied, that it's based on Lehman and Scandry's article, and it's actually the spatial root mean squared of amplitude values at all electrodes, and it's calculated from the grand average across all subjects and all experimental conditions. And then we did permutation tests to get the significant effects within the different windows on the different electrodes that we find in the scope. So these are the results. We had 23 French participants, mean age of 20. And what we can see here is our control sentences were the gray line. Then we have our congruent context in green and our red context in red. And we can see that actually congruent context compared to control were actually less negative. So there was a negativity on the control condition, which was actually expected on the time window that is actually the N400 time window at 345 until the 550 milliseconds, and also later around the 800 milliseconds. And we actually also find a significant effect between the incongruent and the control conditions, also around the same time windows. But actually, we don't find any significant effects between congruent and incongruent contexts. Here you can see the p-values, and so you can see the p-values that were significant in red of those electrodes that were actually having some significant effects. And actually, this shows that we tried to measure the impact of this acoustic and semantic information during this speech segmentation of homophonic sequences in different contexts. And since we actually did not see any difference between our conditions of congruent and incongruent context, then we don't see any difference in integrating these homophones in our tasks. So participants didn't seem to care if a context was favoring or not favoring the correct homophone, right? So actually, without a focused attention, it seems that acoustic cues are actually less important or less robust or less salient to participants compared to lexico-contextual information, so the sentence or the context. And then what we can conclude as well is that fine-grained acoustic information would not actually be used as a cue when exposed to an informative enough context, right? And finally, we can say that there's no clear use of acoustic information when speech is actually processed in a natural sentential context, because we have already this information from context, which may seem to be more salient. And here you have some references. I thank you very much for your attention, and I am glad to hear your questions. Thank you very much.